Hey there, and welcome to another installment of 12 Gauge Contents. So this is going to be the final episode of our big three-parter on the pandemic, and what I learned about it by watching John Carpenter's The Thing. I know it's been a long time since my last installment on this channel, and even longer since part 2 of this particular series, but you can refresh yourself using the links to parts 1 and 2 if you want. Part of why I took a break from this project was to work on some script writing and to complete the release of my latest album, which, if you care, is called Anaximander. It's released under Alex Gage's flagship, and it's available on Bandcamp, YouTube, and all your major streaming gulags. So, Paranoia, here we go. Remember March 2020 when people were afraid about the pandemic? Are we any less paranoid about it now that burnout has set in? In a word, nope. Paranoia. This is what justified going so deep into that Foucault essay in the last video. It wasn't just a wild and unchecked aggression. That would be crazy. Although now that I think about it, having the payoff not wholly land until this video was maybe a bit of a leap pacing-wise. Structural contingencies. So remember way back, if you can, to when we first started this theoretical ride in September, when I said that something I find fascinating about the reaction to COVID-19 and to The Thing isn't that they're both some sort of unprecedented viral alien monster from the unknown to which we know no likeness or adequate response. It's what struck me on my first walk as a pandemic dandy. In both cases, the object of seemingly irrational, invisible paranoia is real. In one way or another, up to now, we all have, and frankly have had no choice but to respond as if the visions of the mad are true. Because here they are. This is part of the reason I thought it worthwhile revisiting the emergence of the practice of containing, rather than banishing the mad with Foucault's essay on the Hôpital Général in Paris and the Great Confinement of the 17th century. And I maintained the use of the term mad because we're not actually talking about a specific or even an actual mental illness. Simply the designation of being unable or unwilling to participate, quote-unquote, usefully in the regular accepted order of things. And now we all share in the mad inverted order of things, which comes to appear to us as no longer strange or nonsensical, but utterly logical and apparent. Of course, the only way to come together is to stay as physically far apart as possible. That just makes sense now. And frankly, it's positively mad. And like any sensible society, we've locked our mad selves up again to protect the accepted, quote-unquote, sane order of things, and we feel, by and large, quite right in doing so. The irony is just that the rational, reasonable conclusion expresses itself almost identically to madness. So to protect the image of a past sane order, we retreat in confined isolation, the domain of the insane, and in a way break from our known reality. In The Thing, when Blair loses his shit entirely and guts the vehicles and smashes the radio to isolate the base, to utterly enclose the reality of the situation on that base, it's the same logic that made us say shut down the borders, slam the brakes on business, the economy. Nothing must change hands. Don't spread your droplets. Keep those things at home. And, in short, has had us demanding with suspicion of our neighbors, who goes there? This paranoia is the central affliction or condition in The Thing and in this pandemic. This crazy hyper-real conundrum where we both should and should not act and think like a paranoiac, where our neighbors and friends and strangers are all equally both healthy in isolation, but also a contamination threat if we were to visit. This paradoxical world is part of why I had to write these essays in the first place, to make sense of everything. This sort of dual simultaneous state is, in my opinion, a key to recognizing the radioactive signature of paranoia generally. But with the confusion and contention over a lot of the details of the pandemic, it's almost as if this is operating on a second, grander level. For anyone familiar with the famous thought experiment of Schrödinger's cat, it's almost as if there's now a second box that contains not only the box with the cat, but the experimenter as well, in an identical sort of quantum state of lethality and non-lethality. Over the past year, we've seen this paranoia operate kind of in two spheres of fear, with some overlap in the middle, what I would like to call a Venn diagram of paranoia. Sphere 1 is a fear of biology, of the body, of the virus. In one way, you could consider it to be a sort of unquestioning terror in the idea that its object of paranoia is permanently unknowable in a certain way. It can't be questioned or made to reveal itself. The danger of the virus is not only invisible, microscopic, but, ultimately there's no clear sort of physical indicator, nothing direct that we can really do. A lot of the threat is based on probabilities, sort of abstract. The second sphere of fear is a fear of society, of political and technological power. To be biblical about it, it is a fear of the word. Simplified, it appears as the uncritical critique of a conspiracist skepticism. In a likewise oversimplification, this narrative is predominated by the so-called alternative narratives and self-professed skeptics. This isn't a hard and fast binary, obviously, because it's a Venn diagram, but these are sort of the two main domains of pandemic paranoia as I see it, and my characterization of the two groups here is just for the purposes of easy caricature to understand, based on the voices that make themselves most visible, so to be easiest to picture as an example. However, as I said, we each as individuals inhabit both of these spheres in our anxious experience of the pandemic to varying degrees. Regardless of whatever your personal beliefs are about the true nature of the pandemic based on your best understanding, or whatever intersectional forces have played to shape your experience of it. Now, this overlap zone is where I personally think the hard critical thinking is to be done, where we can ask those intersectional questions and avoid the dangerous egress into the dark corners of the raving, the ones with truth foaming at their mouths. It is also where some of the most pernicious mistakes are to be made. But at the extreme of either paranoid pole, body or word, the requirement of the position is to put your faith in outsourcing your critical faculty and just hold your breath at that altitude. So I propose that instead we have to confront that, at the end of the day, both sides are faces of one and the same paranoia. A paranoia that, like the life or death of Schrodinger's cat, we've had to learn to hold in our minds as a simultaneity, a concern that is both sane and well-founded, at the same time as much as it is mad and unfounded, but to do so without breaking down into the dissimulation of a cognitive dissonance. A tall order, to be sure. At this point, what then stands out in The Thing is that it's this second sphere of fear, paranoia of the word as I've called it, which is arguably the greatest threat and the ultimate undoing of the research team. Each defining moment of the infection's progression comes about as a consequence of their radical mistrust. The times their paranoia leads them either to cause direct harm to themselves or others, or to simply be too distracted to recognize the movements of the actual thing, instead following around their fellow survivor. This happens from the outset of the film when Gary shoots the Norwegian trying to warn them about the dog thing, and continues all the way to the end of the film with Childs and McCready's post-climax standoff. So this paranoia, this idée fixe, is a tragic flaw that's both our greatest strength and vital weakness. When formalized, such as in our distancing practices, economic and political suspension of activities, etc., it does protect us from that one specific bodily threat, but at the cost of other concerns, right? And the extreme suspicion of the honestly unknown that grounds these policies also comes around to bite us in the ass, because it's the same essential thought that leaves us in a constant heightened state of alert that causes mistrust and hostility between people. Not to mention those who would probably do a far better job of keeping us in touch with reality than would the endless spiraling of social media, or the news, political addresses, press releases, or the other whisperers of secrets in dark corners, be they digital or physical, or the many sorts of gurus offering us their direction from every point of the rose. All of which contain as much paranoia-mongering rumor as news, and I honestly couldn't tell you which category is typically more depressing right now. Paranoia exacerbates the cold feeling of totality that belongs to isolation, particularly for those who live alone, for whom no one is already within their sphere of confinement and surveillance, and therefore within the invisible boundary of safety perceived to be between us, inside, and them, out there, between the healthy and potential spreaders, or between the healthy and those we may perceive to be spreading harmful or misleading information or guidance. Or for those committed to a radical mistrust of the pandemic itself, the concern is the inverse boundary between community and enemy. All this paranoia relates to a fundamental mistrust that we have of the ambivalence of the sublime. Now, in contrast to the sublime, the beautiful, I think we can admit, is a little bit narcissistic, but with a psychoanalytic, sort of Lacanian twist, it's a quality of a recognizable thing that we see reflecting back at us in our desire for and through others, our attraction to them, ourselves, reflecting ourselves to us in a way that we can reaffirm our integrity. However, in his essay Sublime Objects, Timothy Morton makes the interesting point that familiarity is the precondition of horror, and that familiar objects can be, in a very real way, examples of an embodied sublimity, which is something we've talked about before as that state of simultaneous attraction and repellence. And this same paradoxical relationship is shared with paranoia, right? The deeper you sink into a paranoid state, the more you seek out and wholly immerse yourself in all things related to whatever it is that you supposedly are doing all of this out of a desire to keep away from yourself in the first place. But this isn't just a matter of sublime aesthetics. Health and beauty share a stage as a part of the same moral theater. This is always the case. Even setting aside the question of health, there's a line of thinking that says that beauty and morality are always inextricable. But anyway, talking about beauty. Another way of looking at this comes again from Kant, for whom beauty, quote, induces democratic sentiments of universality and sensus communis, allied to the enlarged thinking which comes from our capacity to imagine what it is like to be others, or to engage in concrete moral action. Meanwhile, quote, the sublime draws us away from such democratic impulses into an unworldly inwardness. Now, the sublime terror that I've argued characterizes both the coronavirus pandemic and the interpersonal tension of the thing makes a demon of the demos, of the community. We fear contamination with the other and move from Kant's description of an empathy-based practice of theory of mind or enlarged thinking to a paranoid, selfish one, disconnected from reality. The sublime's influence to have us turn inward reinforces the need to have some kind of control over what is essentially our integrity. In this case, the physical integrity of our cells, or a spoon-fed and problematic conception of independent thought. For Kant, unlike Morton, the sublime is a quality we wholly project onto outside objects. The excess of sublimity the object might impress upon us is directly correlated to the depth of the sense of inwardness that we are able to experience. So when the sublime other takes on a monstrous, ravenous viral form that infects us, compromises ourselves through our bodies, it is not impossible to see how this turn to inwardness in the face of the sublime becomes a concern for the defense of the boundaries defining this special inwardness that is supposedly unique to every individual. Indeed, part of the nature of sublime terror is fear of joining in the apotheotic oblivion of the sublime. In The Thing, we see this in the hostility of the men's paranoia, which, again, they spend more time and energy directing towards each other than they do the actual thing. The very nature of the thing is to obliterate the realm of inwardness of the individual by its infection and assimilation. And naturally, this fear makes the men highly defensive, perhaps more so than if it was something that simply killed them and moved on. But this defensiveness actually limits the depths of the beautiful aspect of their own interiority that's available to them. Not only is the risk physical, characters time and time again repeat that they don't know who to trust, that it's hard to know just who you can trust these days, and trust is a hard thing to come by. They fear one another in body and word. Now, if you don't feel like digging through a bunch of film scholarship, the thematic analysis section of The Thing's Wikipedia page states, the central theme of The Thing concerns paranoia and mistrust. Fundamentally, the film is about the erosion of trust in a small community. It represents the distrust that humans always have for somebody else and the fear of betrayal by those we know and, ultimately, our bodies. So there you have it. Everyone becomes unknown, other, and that's the liminal zone that this film explores. The zone that I would argue the pandemic has thrust us all into. But I'd say the pandemic also strikes us at an interesting time to parallel this mood culturally. The years leading up to now have been filled with the discussions of quote-unquote fake news, opinion bubbles, and the various intelligentsia declaring it a post-truth era. Conflicting opinions are increasingly viewed as dangerous infections to be quarantined, and the constant suspicion this default mode engenders is very like the implications of Hannah Arendt's mood of totalitarian terror that we looked at in part 2. In some of my own work that I did around 2018, I took to seeing this idea of a culture of post-truth as rather the adoption of a post-truth attitude. An attitude or disposition that actually shares much with Arendt and Kant in manifesting as what I'd now consider an aesthetic mood of sublime ideological terror. Say the joy promised to a certain demographic and populism's promise of witnessing the working white poor, for instance. Conversely, there's a perverse and fleeting joy had in the calling out of this attitude, sharing in the beliefs of the bubble. And at the same time, we have the revulsion, condemning the globalist socialist agendas and elites on the one hand, horror at the open bigotry and disregard for civil and human rights reemerging on the other. We're predisposed to suspicion right now, primed for an actual scenario where the paranoia is real, or that is to say, justified, primed for a pandemic. The irony, of course there's always an irony, is that those participating most in the post-truth attitude of paranoia also seem to overlap with those most likely to be mistrustful of sources that take the legitimate potential dangers in the pandemic and pandemic response seriously, and invent parallel dangers against which they have an ideologically satisfying response that they can enact, focusing on a version of the threat of the word that paradoxically makes them feel safer, because it's a problem to which they already know an answer. Typically meaning that the other represented in the threat of the virus has been so successfully scapegoated onto other targets. Or we see excuses made for the mistakes and mismanagement by those in power, and justification for their questionable policies going forward, made by laying blame at the feet of one scapegoat or another, one body of an other. That is legitimate threats of the word. And the bitch of all this is not only do you have to worry about whose agenda is someone pushing, but it makes the necessary suspicion of everyone else as a potential vector for the virus all the more accurate and needed. God damn it. So then the aggravated risk of spread eclipses the possibility of considering the potential countervailing threats or of redistributing the resources of anxious attention of those preoccupied by fear of the virus itself, and we wind up back with the threat of largely unaccountable dictatorial power, unevenly exercising social and economic controls. So now we can see how both polarities of the paranoia are continually recharging one another. The pre-existing paranoid subculture's paranoia of the current mainstream culture of paranoia necessitates the latter paranoid response, the measures of which are taken as justification for the former pre-existing paranoia in a downward doom-scrolling circularity. In The Thing, the democratic, enlarged thinking of the beautiful, of course, explodes and collapses into a black hole of fear, paranoia, and mistrust because the goal of the thing, that is the monster, is to unify and homogenize all life into one assimilated being. It directly threatens their inward existence, from which emanates both the recognition of the beautiful and the sublime, in both positive and negative eminences, as well as their basic existential existence. Anyone potentially turned and now one of those things would, of course, try and convince the rest of the team into a course of action that would enhance its ability to spread through the base and then the rest of the planet. Everything said and everything done by every character must therefore be considered potentially a subterfuge. It's this dynamic that gives the film its horrific tension, right? And so now it's dangerous to accept and incorporate others' ways of thinking into one's own, because it could be the means of infection in your own oblivion. Simply accepting those alternate ways of thinking, or the other's quote-unquote way of thinking, suddenly represents what is possibly the first point or the first stage of your own assimilation into this horrible other thing. So this all leads us to another aspect of the isolationism and paranoia, and that is its enemy, the disintegration of the normal values and morals of a society or social group, the disruption and confusion caused by a state of paranoia in response to whatever discontinuity or threat to the status quo operation of society turns off the gravity holding together those same sort of democratic impulses that Kant describes as forming our, quote, our capacity to imagine what it is like to be others or to engage in concrete moral action. All those anchors that the Sublime floats us away from. What does it mean to engage in moral action in such a state? Normally in society, getting along is a self-preserving instinct, but what about the situation currently where, like we've already discussed, the normal moral actions like visiting an elderly loved one or engaging socially, physically gathering in the community are now represented as immoral? What my generation is used to having itself be criticized for growing up as its quote-unquote antisocial behavior is now considered an act of solidarity or good coping when we go online. The Thing takes this to extremes, but I think of when Knowles cuts the line stranding MacReady out in the snowstorm because he's paranoid that MacReady has already become one of those things. Because he found the Long Johns in MacReady's cabin, where they're returning from. That's a pretty unthinkable measure by just about any normal, reasonable, ethical standard. I think cutting someone's line and stranding them in an Antarctic blizzard is pretty much antisocial to the max. But in context, in the scenario of The Thing, the drive to separate the monstrous impurity from the communal body and to keep it away at all costs makes this kind of merciless act of quarantine morally justified. Indeed, Null's choice is backed up by the community when MacReady makes it back to the base nevertheless, and has to break in through a supply closet because the group has already barricaded off the doors leading outside. And this is what leads to the dynamite versus flamethrower standoff we've talked about in previous episodes, immediately preceding the scene where it is then revealed that the person they tried pretty much unanimously to elect as leader, Norris, is the one who's infected and has been presumably this entire time. The alien virus was elected as the emergency dictator. That's a hard choice to take back. The experience of paranoia leads us instinctively to try and put limits in place wherever we can, to instill a sense of controllability on things. Stay 6 feet, 2 meters, or 1 claymore apart. Don't visit indoors, wash your hands as if you shouldn't have been doing that already, wear a mask, etc., etc., and causes us to dislocate our panic towards things we know how to deal with. The almost caricature example is the rush that there was to panic buy things like canned goods, hand sanitizer, toilet paper, to fret to the exclusion of everything else about the economic repercussions of the shutdown, rather than pay any due to the health impacts or the still impending environmental cataclysm we're facing, or to rebel as an individual in the name of our fractured communities, as if the breakdowns hadn't happened well before the pandemic measures, as if a frontier of social control had not already been established, as if the lockdown was in any way original in giving special privileges to big chain corporations that eliminate the space for independent local businesses, as if these insistences on a specific form of community prioritizing a specific set of values didn't involve the double action of exclusion and vicious corridor sanitaire, far more rigorous than wearing a mask and social distancing, etc. The inconsistency and contradiction that seems endemic to these lockdowns as a species, but that I can speak to, at least in the case of my own experiences living in Ontario, really present to me as clear manifestations of paranoiac constellation-inventing Rorschach-esque thinking at the peaks of social, political, and economic order, which naturally get reflected down here in the valleys. The thirstier and thirstier we get for any sense of surety, the more and more we're ready to take a mirage at face value. I think the basic thinking of paranoia, or that is characteristic of a paranoid mental state and its exuberant constellations traced between the contents of consciousness, not totally, but maybe essentially, explains the unevenness, inequality, misdirection, and arbitrariness of the lockdown and emergency measures where I live, and from what I've been able to learn, likewise in many places globally, concerning severity, who and what and where is affected, when orders are implemented, for how long, and how sincerely they're enforced. I would say that the self-preserving double standards and projection of blame perpetrated by those in government is palpable in the messaging. But all of this paranoia is, in a way, an attempt to bridge the trauma of psychological contact in what we can understand as what that psychoanalytic school of philosophers called the real. This paranoid thinking rising to prominence as a sort of unifying theory of fracturing, which I know as a construct doesn't really make any sense, but it creates a comforting illusion if you buy it, like covering your eyes instead of your mouth and nose, or visiting Chernobyl but just plugging your ears so you can't hear the Geiger counter chirping away. Now, the other I keep referring to has spread through our communities, our consciousnesses, collective and individual, so-called skeptic and mainstreamer alike, and might at any moment violate what seems to be the final site of integrity, that is, our home and then our own physical body, and by greater or lesser extension, those belonging to our loved ones. And by spread, I merely mean become apparent that otherness is an integral part of the self. And forgive my German, but das Unheimliche ist heimlich, the uncanny is homely, or private. And I feel like I should repeat again that the entire subject of this series of essays is the entire phenomenon that is the pandemic. Contact with the virus itself is optional, at the same time as everything is predicated on contact with the virus itself, and the direct knock-on or adjacent effects of contact with the virus. Anyways, back on topic. Just as in The Thing, the research team doesn't have to figure out just how to kill the alien, but how to deal with each other, how to prevent the alien from assimilating anyone else, how to protect themselves, how to function and subsist. They still have to eat and sleep eventually, and the fact that they're prevented from doing this only exacerbates their tension and their incapacity to deal with the situation adequately and rationally, effectively. They have to confront the question of how or if they can rejoin the rest of the world, what to do if they themselves are exposed or compromised. Perhaps most importantly, they have to figure out how to confront their latent, pre-existing dysfunction and what the alien encounter doesn't change, but instead reveals about themselves as individuals and as a group. I'm convinced that nothing about the pandemic should be read as a metaphor, but instead treated as a mirror, and I'd argue that the only novel thing about the pandemic is the particular strain of coronavirus. The only thing that is truly novel. Okay, so at last it's probably time to take a moment to really define the other and the real that appear to us through the sublime like light through a torn curtain. And by define, I mean quickly gloss. The other is a term with vast and variegated use in history. It's instrumental in processes of exotic fascination, fetishization, idealization, disdain, bigotry, xenophobia, racism, phobias of every kind, ontological proofs, philosophies of hospitality, psychology and psychotherapy, the basic way we define our quote-unquote selves as individuals separate from the mass of humanity and corporeal physical existence, organic and inorganic, with unique thoughts and feelings and much, much more. However, in last year's publication, Pandemic, our friend from Part 1, Slavoj Žižek, has a very serviceable definition of the other for our present purpose. He writes, quote, "The other here is the all-powerful invisible agent who haunts a paranoiac." Done. Boom. For the time being, that's the kind of other we're talking about. COVID-19 is our other here, and it can manifest in the many guises of different paranoid fantasies as easily as in scientifically legitimated concerns. Concerns and fantasies about the virus itself, as well as those concerning response measures and compliance questions. And as we've talked about before and is ever present in our comparison of the pandemic and the thing, it is an other that can manifest in the form of any one, potentially. You could argue that the coronavirus, or even the pandemic more generically, has been othered in just about every manifestation of the concept of other I just listed above. And the pandemic phenomenon itself has then taken that othering and projected it on everything and everyone like a cracked prism. But this is a generic othering that is just anything that's, well, that other, unlike ourselves and mysterious to our way of living, thinking, and feeling as we've come accustomed. The other exists as a concept constructed to show ourselves what is, or maybe, that we are not. But like Kant's view of the sublime, the content of an other is defined by what we ourselves project into it. In the thing is the obvious other, but under the influence of paranoia, the men on the base other one another, and more or less gradually estrange or other themselves, slipping into alien mindsets and adopting these really drastic foreign dispositions and actions. In another vein, Fuchs, I believe, is the one who puts it that someone could be infected and never even realize before they disappeared into their own thing replicant, dissolving the existence of any sort of ability to discern or for there to even exist a clear boundary between self and other. Meanwhile, that persistent theme of disintegrating trust reveals itself best not in the untrustability of the team members, but that each team member's ability to trust their own judgment, to discern between kind and other, even concerning their own selves, disappears. Now, the real is a concept that's a little slippery to grasp. It actually doesn't mean just what is reality opposed to illusion, unfortunately. It's described as experienced through traumatic ruptures in the symbolic order of life that break down the signification or the essential meaning-making interaction of the contents of daily reality. Through these gaps, something alien and unrecognizable, unspeakable even, enters into our livelihood like a leak into a submarine. But the kicker is that the pressure gauges, clinometers, and other instruments this submarine is equipped with still read out as if all is normal. The result is that you can no longer proceed as if this protective hull was still intact, and yet there's no measure or language to deal with or to communicate this otherworldly leak. So essentially, we order reality according to our values as a society, as individuals. We transform and arrange the real world physically and in our minds through language, a series of symbols, through beliefs articulated through that language, through social structures, through building buildings and transforming and using the land, all according to how we understand things fundamentally work, how we think they should or ought to work, and by what is important to us, through our body language and our physical presence, our actions, and through interacting with the symbolic content of cultural objects and by social interaction. This is how we get the world as we know it, with religions and capitalism and global trade and science and literature and independent music scenes and circles of friends, cuisine, jobs, jokes, politics, inner monologues, and fucking everything. The discourse or interaction of all these things reaffirms this symbolic order of the day-to-day or quotidian life by which we come to have a fundamental and pretty reasonable, pretty reliable grasp on how to interpret events and basically reality. How we get up, eat, go to work, come home, relax, be intimate with a partner, see friends on the weekends or evenings, maybe work late one day so you can get a new thing or do something fun or invest in whatever's important to you, teach your children, hopefully well, do art, do whatever it is that you do. And the rhythm all this activity supports, by design almost, makes it seem meaningful, makes it seem important, like it underpins human life with a sense of everything working properly. And in this sense, it is inherently mentally meaningful. It's important. And it's important and meaningful for this rhythmic entrainment to be working properly. And when you divide the universe in this way, the real is the remainder of that equation. What's left in the chinks of the order we live by, it is the gaps between the footboards of the rickety rope bridge, or what some interpret with alarm as chaos. The real's intrusion is through what does not fit or denies the continuity of the patterns and surfaces that make up our lives and worldviews. And this basically describes the breach of the pandemic into the symbolic order of our day-to-day life that I've been yammering on about for, 2.5 of these videos, each about an hour long. It is everything that cannot exist contiguously with the rest of the interlocking pattern on the surface of reality, and yet nonetheless exists. And the pandemic as an experience is one of the real that exceeds the surface by breaking into these patterns of human activity and security, and then breaking those patterns apart. It's like suddenly we are given evidence that those patterns aren't natural, aren't even necessary, that they are the products and byproducts of human activity, not the source of human activity. A product of the combined applications of thought and action, of a praxis, that aren't something bigger than we are, even if we're somehow only a constituent part of it. And this is evidence that we can try to accept or to deny. This is a part of how even those whose daily rhythms are minimally affected are still suffering psychological effects. They are continuing to participate in a pattern, a rhythm they've just discovered doesn't hold the same meaning, doesn't provide the security it did for them before the advent of the pandemic. They must become, in a way, extra paranoid almost. Because whereas those working from home for the first time, or who were laid off, or who were used to a lifestyle of travel but now find themselves unusually confined, don't trust their new scenario of pandemic where the real barges in like the Kool-Aid man from Jonestown. They instinctively distrust what is other and different, what is novel and unknown from the pre-pandemic norm. This is something that they're facing down like a challenge. Some people were able to enter this unknown with a feeling of solidarity, like a squad of troopers. Those for whom little or nothing have changed are suddenly confronted by the same apocalyptic real, if that's what we're going to call it, only the message they receive is that everything that was supposed to be a normal and safe life, or secure and knowable, predictable, something that was of the individual's life and identity, that was recognized and validated by society, is now suddenly inverted and defined as a condition of being under threat, a part of the imposition of otherness upon us, a sign of the danger to the social, physical, psychological, and moral health, that is to say, order, co-opted by unknown intruding menaces of biological or political natures. Looking at it this way, almost what choice is there but to be paranoid when suddenly for them, acting normally or according to the established routine is now encoded as a sign of the pandemic that they have a personal and civic responsibility to be vigilantly suspicious of. The thing mimics those it assimilates perfectly. Speech, memories, behaviors, nervous tics, all those defining idiosyncrasies of thought and action that make a person who they are. Only suddenly those normal qualities that used to indicate a benign or helpful presence are now qualities of the thing, presuming you believe in a ghost when you see it. One, but by no means the only example we can use to illustrate this effect of the pandemic real, refracting the hegemonies of pre-pandemic normalcy, behaving almost like a critical lens in a way, is by considering both it and the thing in the context of the body horror subgenre, but as exemplars of a second-level extended body horror, dealing with bodies and bodies as and bodies in space. In the isolation essay, we mentioned some of the themes in The Thing have been interpreted through the lenses of critiquing masculinity and homophobia in respect to the revulsion, dominance, desire of, and intercourse, quote-unquote, between male bodies. But it is also about traditionally male or masculine roles. This does apply to the bodily role of penetrator or impregnator, so to speak, played by the Thing, or usurped by the Thing. But it also applies to the conflict over the role or position of patriarch between the men on the base, over who gets to assert their dominant or alpha male influence over the space and the other men, and who's going to be submissive, or in chauvinistic terms, quote-unquote womanish or hysterical. I would argue that on another level, The Thing actually confronts at this extended body horror level a degree of transphobia, almost as an extension of this hyper-masculine homoerotic homophobia that it kind of critiques, or, can be interpreted as critiquing. This reading is probably only possible from closer to our contemporary viewpoint, and not so much when it was made in 1982, but that doesn't preclude the presence of this subtext in any meaningful way. Death of the author, yada yada yada. Symbolically speaking, in 2020, we all tacitly decided it was okay for space to be gender fluid, at least in one direction, but in a kind of don't ask, don't tell sort of way. Now, in this series, we've already looked at how so-called home or domestic and workspaces or public spaces have been forcibly collapsed. A perhaps inevitable event, but one no doubt drastically accelerated. Now, historically, the idea of a theory of separate public and private spheres and who gets to move freely between them, hint, it's not been women, goes back a long way. We know that at least as far back as the 4th century BC, Aristotle wrote down a version of this theory of confinement, and the modern iteration of the dichotomy of domestic and public, including work, spaces, more or less took shape in the furnaces of the European Industrial Revolution of the 18th century. In the last 100 years or so, a lot of hard-fought progress has been made to lift this barrier and accept women's rights to occupy the public sphere and the workplace. Although the assumptions, explicit and unconscious alike, informed by the theory of separate spheres, still undergirds a lot of modern-day sexism. And this gets reflected in the way that women have been disproportionately affected during the pandemic in terms of employment. Because for one reason or another, or for multiple reasons, more women than men haven't kept their pre-pandemic jobs simply by working from home. Now we can look into the question about demographically who is occupying the jobs that can't be done from home, but we can also use as an illustrative example the case of parents and the increased pressure of the workload of the so-called domestic sphere when daycares and schools have been closed and children need a parent to supervise them and facilitate their participation in remote learning. Even in the case of a heterosexual couple with similar level white-collar jobs that can be done remotely, the odds are that it is the woman and not the man who is most likely to have to leave or quit work while their partner carries on in the next room, if one of them is going to have to do so. Oftentimes, it can be as simple as the fact that even if they were, co-workers with the same position, men on average are getting paid at better rates than women. So financially, if someone has to give up professional quote-unquote work to help kids with online school, it's really hard for that couple to think that they have much of a choice in a time when money's already tight, other than for the person with the higher salary to be the one who keeps quote-unquote working. And I'm not even going to touch how problematic that language is. But here's the case. Is not by one definition any work now domestic work if it takes place in one's own domestic space or sphere? Traditionally, the woman at the cleaners or the seamstress is paid for her work, but not the woman at home in her own laundry room or mending things by needlepoint on the couch. What's the difference about the work here performed aside from the space in which it is done? The pandemic puts a spotlight on the mentality that claims work done in the domestic sphere isn't work with economic value. I'm pretty sure that anyone who's pivoted from doing what was once a powerful, high-level office job to working from home certainly still wants full pay for all their work done in the domestic sphere. Obviously, none of this is a new critique in and of itself, but the pandemic has meant that suddenly the ideological dichotomies of what certain bodies and certain spaces mean has collapsed into a shared space. Another irony of distancing, to be sure. That more women than men have had to leave their work in the public sphere when suddenly the workplace, the home, school, daycare, etc., all became a single location. Aside from the pay gap, there's nothing inherent that can explain why one type of work, the traditionally public, quote-unquote, masculine, or traditionally domestic, quote-unquote, feminine, should be privileged or protected over the other, when all now, in kind of a radical way, appear and exist side by side in a shared space. And I haven't heard a lot of wisecracks about the softy in the office who already worked from home all the time before the pandemic lately. Bodies and spaces codefine and encode one another in activity, and this has always been a central axis in gender discourses, generally speaking. Bodies must exist in space, and so the pandemic has quietly violated certain boundaries of bodily integrity, shall we say, by collapsing and dissolving the differentiation between the types of spaces different bodies inhabit and perform within. Or at least we could say that it has brought about a sense of rupture by how suddenly the pandemic has accelerated the collapse of these different spheres into a single shared fluid space, to the point where it becomes almost impossible to support the construct of othering needed to have a tenable idea of, masculine and feminine space. TLDR, home offices are kind of trans, or at least fluid, and I'm not upset about that. At the risk of sounding like a Freudian, I've got to qualify my claim and say, of course, none of this is explicitly accepted. It's repressed, and hence its contribution to the overhanging sense of paranoia and personal attack by the government or whomever. But I would be remiss to not be clear. Another further unfortunate and problematic irony is how, at the same time as the pandemic has collapsed public or work and private or home spaces, women are continuing to be, and in new ways are excluded from public activity as domestic spaces are further subdivided in an attempt to create a professional zone free of quote-unquote distraction for students and for those quote-unquote working from home to operate in. And of course, this is all happening at the same time as we see women be freshly excluded from that transcendent entity known as the workforce, and all of the rights and privileges and independences that come along with being a member of this category. In many cases, the shift to working from home or to not working was less of a considered choice than it was a sudden necessity. And so this particular experience of working from home can be caught in a tension, denial, a struggle to remain separate, not only from the responsibilities of domestic space, but also by extension from the elements the space contains that are actually important, like intimacy, rest, the non-work aspects of a full human life. And this is something we looked at in the isolation segment, discussing the problematics of always being both at home and at work. Again, something that was not an invention of the pandemic, but magnified in its mirror to the point we can finally see into the cracks. Saying nothing of the increase in domestic violence that's been reported over the past year and a bit. And while I don't think that this particular essay is really equipped to fully deal with this angle, I think it's at least worth noting in our comparison of The Pandemic and The Thing, the way the film depicts the reaction of maladjusted men when the symbolic order that has taught them how to exist, embodied in space as men, collapses, once the codes of masculinity are stripped of their meaning in a freshly and abruptly liminal space. Alright, you know what? I'm doing this at a more natural human rate of speaking, so it's taken us a little longer to zip through all of this material. So I think this is a perfectly natural place to take a little break. I'm going to split this last one into two parts. This trilogy brought to you by Peter Jackson. So tune back in for part 3.2, I guess. And I'm going to dive pretty much immediately back into it. We're not going to do a recap, so we're just going to tear straight on. But for now, I'm going to take a little break, quit tripping over my words, and yeah. Okay, welcome back. How was that intermission for you? Personally, I never mind a chance to catch my breath. So, as promised, we're just picking up in media res. Yes, das Ding, or das Ding on sich, I still don't speak German, is what Kant thought loomed behind or beyond things as they appear to our limited human perceptions. Writing in his prolegomena to any future metaphysics, that while we can sense the appearance of things, these objects of sense are merely appearances. Quote, they are based upon a thing in itself, though we know not this thing as it is in itself, but only know its appearance, viz. The way in which our senses are affected by this unknown something. Much like our experience of the thing of John Carpenter's film, we witness it in many forms, many appearances and recombined appearances, but we have no grasp of what the thing, or the thing in itself, looks like, or even if it has an appearance of its own as we would understand it. And this holds for the pandemic as well. We come to understand that it has many forms and yet still no form apparent, no appearance. We're left to perceive it through all of the different symptoms, all of the influences that it's had upon our lives. And while the virus itself is visible under a microscope, identifiable, nonetheless, we have the emergence of all the variants, which are equally the virus of the pandemic. But the pandemic as an object of perception appropriates and recombines the appearance of other things. It displaces their role in the symbolic order of our reality, causing them to represent something other, something alien and deadly, despite the fact that, as we've discussed before with concepts of sublimity, it is only our own powers of projection that do all of this representational work. And I hasten to add that we do this projection in response to trying to apprehend the very real appearance, emergence, or breach of the pandemic and the virus that causes it onto the scene, into reality. And so our experience of the virus is something which, even more so than the thing of the film, is something that we can only sense indirectly as a possible presence. It looks like people we might feel the need to cross the street to avoid coming near. It looks like video calls in shirt sleeves, a tie, and underpants. It moves with the movements or non-movements of lockdown. In between the lines of those lockdown legislations, we strain to recognize it in every cough or sneeze out of someone's, including our own, mouth. It moves behind the "no customers allowed inside" sign in shop windows, the now shuttered independent businesses. It is behind the dead eyes of the politician reading the latest emergency measure on TV, studded with folksy interjections designed to disarm us when they call us friends, folks. Dusting is a denizen of the order of the real, that real as written about by Lacan and the psychoanalysts. However, I want to skip forward back to Zizek, whose thinking is deeply influenced by Lacan. I don't always know how often I agree with Zizek's endpoints. Conclusions is almost the wrong word for his style of writing and philosophy, but a good friend once commented to me that Zizek himself probably isn't sure how often he agrees with his own endpoints either. Nevertheless, I find his way of thinking and methods of putting questions at least stimulating and more often than not helpful, regardless if I might disagree by the end. So here we are. Zizek splits the real into multiple modalities that breach our collective consciousnesses as we experience society and the products of culture. There are two in particular I want to mention, the real real and the imaginary real. These are the thing we sense as horrifying in horror movies, and the phenomenon of a phantasmal excess, a surreal quality that seemingly spills over into our reality and saturates it with an awful quality of the sublime. And while the thing is technically prohibited from participating in this latter modality by nature of being itself the horrifying thing in a horror film, I believe that the ways in which I've tried to show its similarities to our experience of the pandemic means that COVID-19 operates in a dual modality of this realness. A realness that exists no differently for those who do and those who do not believe in the current scientific opinions and related socio-politico-economic measures. If you reject the pandemic narrative or accept it, it requires no less constant mental effort to confront either face of the quote-unquote real pandemic. And the only relief would be to live alongside it in indifference, and indifference is hardly living. This inescapability is because for those of us not providing frontline services, there is a prevailing component of voyeurism. There's nothing we can do, or nothing is precisely what we are told is required of us to do, beyond basic personal hygiene. So we sit at home during lockdowns to be carpet bombed with a steady stream of information, news reports, articles, tweets, blogs, videos, petitions, memes, sound bites, etc., etc., etc. We are asked to watch our distance and specifically to not interact. For some of us, in public spaces like a grocery store, when somebody violates the new hygiene regimes, potentially spreading or exposing themselves to the virus, or suddenly an irate customer decks the store manager who comes to instill order, it's that same moment of, don't go in there! That character is totally the thing! No, they've got the wrong person! Wait, what is happening? It was them? The whole time? That you suddenly yell at the screen in a horror movie. Or maybe you yell it out loud. There's two kinds of people. Others might see these violations as a bold statement on defending individual liberty, against whom is perhaps often foggy and will depend on who you ask, but in reality, maybe unacknowledged reality, it is not against any human power structure, but again the pandemic beast itself. In a way, it's an all-in hand to convince ourselves we are somehow still uncorrupted, that despite everything we've experienced, we maintain a personal integrity, whether or not you see that primarily as a bodily, physical integrity surrounding health, or as an ideological one based on certain principles. We've spent the last year largely watching the pandemic unfold, most of us unable to act and interact in any significant direct way, or in very limited ways at least. There are the indirect things we do. We work remotely, we bathe in hand sanitizer, we Zoom call, we distance, etc., etc. But this isn't the kind of natural disaster we can all stack sandbags against together. But make no mistake, this is a natural disaster, and a large part of how we end up calculating the damage of a natural disaster comes in looking at how we responded to it. Did we ignore it? Did we do enough? Did we make it better? Or did we make it worse? But one thing is certain. We have been directly, and some of us more profoundly than others, affected materially and spiritually, or psychologically if you're squeamish, by the presentation before us. Even if your position is that of conspiracy-favoring skepticism, or if you simply don't fear the disease for one reason or another, there's still the egoistic, not unfounded, not immoral, fear simply of the financial repercussions, or the state's imposition upon a myth of a previously unbridled liberty as understood, and the specter of the pandemic thing then becomes the supernatural other of the Leviathan-like state, or whatever secret cabal, rather than the supernatural other taking the form of the viral monster. Unlike usual discourses surrounding the concept of gaze, our position here as speculating spectators is one of vulnerability, especially at the beginning when we could really only make things worse by attempting to participate, and yet this intrusion of the real, this crossing over, brings the thing to where we live. Despite being reduced to the activity of a voyeur, there was never any real option to sit this one out, removed from the zone of potential danger. Zizek writes in Pandemic, reality is external reality, our social and material space to which we are used and within which we are able to orient ourselves and interact with others, while the real is a spectral entity, invisible and, for that very reason, appears all-powerful. However, the moment the spectral agent becomes part of our reality, even if it means catching a virus, its power is localized. It becomes something we can deal with, even if we quote-unquote lose the battle. So long as this transposition into reality cannot take place, Zizek argues we get trapped either in anxious paranoia, pure globality he calls it, or resort to ineffective symbolizations through acting outs that expose us to unnecessary risks, which he deems as pure locality. I remember one of the first days after the pandemic was declared as such, and the state of emergency was enacted here. A doctor with Health Canada was interviewed on the CBC and asked about the opinion that the proposed measures and successive declarations of states of emergency were hysterical. His reply seemed earnest. He didn't spend the usual political moment to formulate a correct response. And as far as I can remember, his words were, "I hope when this is over, people come up to me and say this was all for nothing, that we overreacted. If someone can come up to me afterwards and say, see, all that and nothing happened, it means that we did our job right in doing exactly what was necessary to prevent this from becoming something really terrible." Oops, so much for that hope. To take a moment to clarify again, it's not that I'm arguing the coronavirus, or the thing for that matter, are either actually the real, as far as that abstract technical term goes, and as far as I understand it adequately. What I've been arguing is important is the fact that our experience isn't of the virus itself for the most part, and you'll notice I've been discussing the pandemic in a way it exists as a lived social and psychological phenomenon. But it is the intrusion of the virus's existence and the responses or non-responses we've taken to it, breaching our mundane day-to-day reality, that is a conduit of this sensation of sublime and monstrous real. But in the brutal, naked, and godless modern style, our monster has suitably no metaphor. In this way, not a historically unique way, it breaks the rules of aesthetics being what suggests to us sublimity or the presence of an overwhelming thing in itself. Remember, I don't buy into the overwhelming amount of war metaphors we've been using, or the allegorical abstraction of the pandemic narrative. As I've said before, to me, the pandemic is a mirror, not a metaphor, and our experiences of it in themselves are enough to suggest the real, the excess, and don't require the mediation of an additional layer of metaphor on top. What is undeniable, and what is also unique to our experience in the history of human disease relations, is all that is contingent on our contemporary historical context, that COVID-19 exists in the reality of early 21st century Earth, and so do we. But our primary interaction with the virus is vis-a-vis COVID-19's presenting absence. Its presence in the negative spaces it has opened up in life as we know it, the imaginative interstices of possibility that pass through the walls of reality in which we are each and together isolated, corridors formerly saturated by the content of reality as we knew it in the before times, overlapped by the patterns of our meaningful structures. Now these chinks in the grout ooze sublime paranoia. We perceive and are touched by the pandemic in our negative spaces. Part of Zizek's point was that to be directly marked, changed, even injured by the virus makes it at the very least identifiable, clarifies what it is and what it is not, what is and what is not effective action. It dispels the enchantment of paranoia brought on by the unknown and unknowableness. In the world of the thing, it's only when the tentacles emerge that you can tell which figure isn't human and blast it with a flamethrower. But when we isolate to contain spread, most of us will not, or at least at this moment have not, have witnessed the direct effects of contact in the sense of being infected with the virus. Fewer still the reality of what is termed a case of significant illness. The closest we come is in the statistics we're regularly consuming, like multivitamins. Not really sure of what the printed measurement of the ingredients on the bottle mean, but comforted in knowing that they are quantifiable. They are abstract attempts, a third Zizek modality of the real, the symbolic real, at gesturing towards the function of a cripplingly plethoric and multidimensional phenomenon. The statistical models themselves are not real, or we could as easily say they're also not unreal, in that they are models, simulations reflecting actual events. This is fine. But they are not embodied for us in any non-intellectually meaningful ways. Or, I guess the less pedantic, uncircumlocuitous way to say that is that stats don't mean anything emotionally, while we can avoid encountering the virus, the conduit of the real, and for those of us who refuse or resist altering our habits, we probably still won't witness the viruses or humanity's direct effectuations in the pandemic experience if we refuse to recognize the visible signs that point towards what we can't see with the naked human eye. That negative space. The pressure, the stakes of the pandemic, and what makes it so intangible is that we still have to head it off before the real, this phantasmic other species, saturates actual reality, our reality. And that is our front line, reality itself. If the thing makes it out of Antarctica and reaches the world, it's game over, man. Game over. It's only within this oniric, paranoid realm that it can be isolated, even at high cost. Originally, this was in the hopes this high price would still be nowhere near the human cost it would take from us to combat it in the open spaces of the real world, or the waking world, or what we've come to call nostalgically normal life. The going theory being that it would have simply wreaked havoc on that kind of life, that kind of reality. Again, we don't talk about it anymore, but the biggest argument for lockdown originally focused a lot less on COVID deaths than the calculus that the influx of patients into the healthcare system, if the virus ran its course unchecked, would be enough to crash those healthcare systems altogether, and thereby cause a lot more suffering, trauma, and death indirectly than from the actual virus itself. So talking about direct COVID deaths, or about direct COVID deaths prevented, is somewhat a red herring. We have a pervasive tendency to argue the wrong statistics, and you know what? That's because it's complicated. This is hard. And we shouldn't immediately assume someone is stupid just because we disagree about what the data means if we don't first agree about what data is even important, about what data we're actually talking about. This is to say nothing of the proliferation of confusing information and rhetoric interbreeding out there, or the ever-evolving dataset itself. But I think this difficulty in distinguishing the data, specifically the difficulty brought about by all the baggage we bring with us to the issue and foist into the interpretation of the numbers, like newts and eyeballs into a cauldron, actually brings us to the paranoid object par excellence, the mirror. The mirror externalizes all the things of self we would project onto the other, but, being a mirror, here exteriorizes it in our own image, our own desire and fear. Here, pandemic paranoia becomes a species of body dysmorphic disorder. Zizek refers to ineffective symbolizations, and what he means by this are attempts to confine, to reduce, what is of the real in the pandemic, as well as confine the scope of the actual dangers to realms of reality that are actually safe from, at reduced risk from, or actually just not as dangerous to us if they are in some way damaged or altered by the pandemic. He gives the most infamous of these ineffective symbolizations as former U.S. President Donald Trump's, among other political leaders, vocal concern for the quote-unquote health of the economy, urging Americans to get back to work in order to protect it from a virus that actually infects people. His racist yellow terror-flavored speeches about the China virus threatening the economy, never threatening people, never considering the dangers of the pandemic as a broad whole like we're trying to look at here. It's looking at the wrong dangers to the wrong things. A local example for me is that our last lockdown ended with an opening up, and then our much larger third wave, and the Premier, Doug Ford, decided that the problem was the fact that the US-Canada border was open, and that the only problem came from all of these people coming from across the border. Now, anyone who's at all aware of the state of the Canada-US border in Ontario, or more generally, doesn't really have much time for this, but nonetheless, it is a way of symbolizing, confining the real, the big pandemic other into just a simple human foreign other. And of course, we've seen this to a far more dangerous degree in the anti-refugee and anti-immigrant scapegoating, the spike in visible anti-Asian racism. This ineffective symbolization is also simply the victim blaming or the projection of blame from those in power to just ordinary citizens. The continual behests to do the right thing, that if only we would follow directions, this would all be over soon and none of these larger plans would have failed. These appeals to self-police and lay the responsibility at the feet of the individual. And just as I've said, make no mistake, this is a natural disaster. It's also the way we like to deal with natural disasters. The problem of climate change. Oil companies inventing the concept of the carbon footprint, happy to delegate the responsibility for the environment to the individual. The same to a large extent goes with the pandemic. And as much as individual choice and agency is incredibly important, we don't live in a system where individual liberty and responsibility and agency is a viable scapegoat for the larger machinations that we make our choices within. These ineffective symbolizations are a good way of rerouting, diverting the conversation and the courses of action, but they're not always deliberately or consciously undertaken. More often than not, ineffective symbolization isn't a part of some sort of scheme. It's just what we do. It's a very human response, particularly when we're overwhelmed. It offers a seeming way out of our confusion, our helplessness. In The Thing, all but MacReady try and convince themselves it's a matter of long johns. And the only reason he doesn't is probably because MacReady's the only one disproportionately endangered by this line of thinking. It being a pair of his long johns they find, shredded in a way to make it look like the Thing has assimilated him. As a reminder, the Thing rips through your clothing when it assimilates you, so they figure if your underwear is intact, then you are too. It's absurd when I say it out loud, but in the moment it makes sense to them, given how much else they can't possibly know. This is a piece of information that it's definite, manageable, knowable. The pure globality aspect is the shocking confrontational force of the Sublime, the scope of how it infiltrates and suffuses malignantly all aspects of living and socializing in reality as we knew it. And this is what makes something like the novel coronavirus or The Thing so hard to deal with, emotionally as well as practically. How do you deal with something you can't identify on its own, that you actually have to avoid, but can't recognize it until it's attached to something or someone you were trying to keep it separate from? The constant heightened state of paranoia wears us out, even those spending lockdowns in relative comfort, or even those in complete rejection of the pandemic narrative, are experiencing the burnout, in part because the efforts to symbolize the virus are inevitably frustrated, as it's this species of other, like the Thing, that can so easily lose its symbol, its name, change its form, because its only recognizable containing form is in us, is the good. It lives by passing through the insulation between the conduits and circuits of what is supposed to be the law of things, capitalizing and exploiting the fact that all our distinctions are man-made. Things may be separate from one another, but the way in which we distinguish them is unique to us. And this is incredibly important to our ability to adapt and to imagine, but it also is a vulnerability, because it's subject to change. Ineffective symbolizing can be thought of as kind of like the bargaining stage of grief. The sanctity of form and symbol is not unique to thinkers of the political right or left, and it's important for many from the most conservative to the most radical. It's behind the appeal of some of the most popular thinkers, from conservative theologians and the capitalist economics of Adam Smith, to even the supposedly more boundary transgressive ideas of Marshall McLuhan, or post-structuralist or postmodernists, from Marx and Engels to Jordan Peterson, from anarchists to neo-fascists. Even those who want to critique the legitimacy or even the truth to these forms or these forms' existence still rely on the fundamental sanctity of form and symbol, even if it is only for the sake of being able to then defile them. The inherent and fundamental power and, as I've characterized it, sanctity of form and symbol is also the power structure of so much great art, right? It's why a monster movie, albeit a special case among its kind, is so important to me right now that I've emerged yet again from my stupor to finish recording these thousands of words to keep this essay project going forward. However, to give the novel coronavirus pandemic its own monster metaphor, like the Minotaur of Crete that symbolized the greed and corruption ruling the city and its leaders, would be to define it, to limit it. But that's not the nature of our experience of it. The pandemic provides a context to question all our interrelationships and distinctions, our interdependencies and dependencies, from the global and civilizational right down to the intimately interpersonal and even intrapersonal. The virus is, of course, a real, in the usual sense, and limited thing biologically, but this is inconsequential compared with what it does to destabilize our meaningful structures. It can only appear, as I've said, as a mirror, not a metaphor, because without the law of forms, we are forced to question what we see, to be suspicious, even paranoid. And what we see skirting these laws is our own reflection, as individuals, as societies, because our symbolic structures, and we all rely on a multiplicity of them, no longer give us their former power to order and discern, i.e., we assume we know a sick person when we see one, what one infected with a plague looks like, but of course that's not the case, as best exemplified by the threat of asymptomatic carry, which, by the way, isn't even new to the pandemic. Think of plague rats, think of mosquitoes, but here it's in our own form, human form, the form we self-identify with as ourselves. In this sense, the other, the alien, the disease is or becomes, vis-a-vis anyone, that is to say, face-to-face, everyone. This applies as much to the protagonists of the thing as it does to us as both voyeurs and as protagonists. The men of the thing actually expose themselves to extra risk and excess paranoia when they isolate what they see as localizable threats, but that are not ultimately the thing, or are not yet the thing, when they deal with secondary problems caused by the outbreak or deal in those ineffective symbolizations. I'm thinking again about the part where Knowles strands MacReady in the blizzard, having found the ripped long johns while investigating MacReady's cabin, and when the team decides to lock up Blair, not because they suspect him of being infected, any more than anyone else anyways, but for going berserk in the radio room, trashing the equipment with an axe, probably what was his last human act, to try and keep the thing from spreading off base. In the former case, the danger comes from the subterfuge. They would think they had stopped at least one thing, but in reality would only have killed the remaining human most capable of handling the outbreak. In the latter, once Blair has been overcome by his infection and assimilated, his being left unchecked allows the Blair thing to find a way to move in and out of its confinement, transgressing supposedly firm boundaries again, and nearly manages to build a spacecraft out of salvage from the camp to get itself off base. Not to mention whatever other mischief, menace, and infection it accomplishes off camera. What makes the thing most dangerous is that it cannot be seen as it is, its true nature, in the context of society. It is only a superposited or superpositional, quantum-like omnipresence of the paranoiac's other. It fills everyone and everything with uncertainty, and because the final stage of thing assimilation bestows the asymptomatic appearance of health, the appearance of health is a symptom of infection in this case. Everyone in the film is constantly at each other's throats, convinced only that they are still human. A mindset MacReady explicitly states in his speech around the burning Bennings thing, declaring that the one thing he does know is that he's still human. Something that can do absolutely nothing to assure the rest of the team that he is in fact still human. This single principle is the motivation for every character throughout the rest of the film, that they're still human, even though of course they might, like Blair and Norris, have become infected earlier and are only as yet asymptomatic. Fuchs is the only one self-aware enough to realize what's happening and self-destruct when he's attacked. This point might be the most dangerous part for the frontline team of the film and for the human race. Not to mention it's psychologically very unhealthy and frankly just unhelpful. The thing is at its most powerful when it is unknown, when all they can really do is either fear, ignore, or be ignorant of what is unknown. What we can prepare for is whatever we can imagine, and that is based on certain sets of principles, right? How much they overlap with reality when the unknown crosses into the known is a question with only one way to find out. But when the virus becomes real, fully crosses over, a situation of collective understanding emerges, such as the blood test interrogation scene or the autopsy scene immediately before it. It is those fleeting moments when the team is able to put all else, primarily their mistrust and paranoia, aside and pull together with enough implicit trust to actually confront the thing directly. This is in stark opposition to Blair's isolated apocalyptic revelation in the lab scene early on, when he runs tests using the dog thing cells and first discovers the alien life form's true nature, and possibly realizes he's already exposed himself to it. I'm getting tired of saying ironically. Ironically, the team member's individual integrity can only be defended as a collectivity when the other momentarily assumes clear form, and through its momentary manifestation as disorder, reveals itself through what is a temporary implication of order. That this shapeless alien mass is something separate from the multiplicity of human collectivity, of human forms, and identification. This temporary restoration of the order of form dispels the ineffectiveness and paralysis of the team members' paranoia and generates a space in which the thing becomes vulnerable and, finally, by definition, limited. Every glimmer of certainty allows the team to reconfigure this momentary alliance and trust based on the best available knowledge at the time. Whatever is speculation can be subordinated or put into a process of contextualization with what is shown, even if it puts the person suspected of thingship 2 lines of dialogue ago immediately in command and at the cost of a portion of their own liberty and discretion, such as again happens in the blood test scene. I think we in the real world have proven ourselves of a similarly dedicated flexibility, though over a much longer time lapse, in the evolving responses of people, and sometimes, and to a much lesser extent, policy, to the pandemic as our specialist and popular knowledge about the virus and its behaviors has increased or changed. Richard Kearney writes about how the monstrous is made monstrous through incomprehension, through our refusal of it as an impossible collection of parts. The paranoiac sees everything as connected, but the indefinite, uncertain scope of it, the inability to discern who or who is not involved, for instance, is what gives rise to that special realm of terror and what separates them from the potential insights of the connections they uncover by camouflaging them in unfounded conjecture and misinformation. It does not require quote-unquote evil or malice, not even deception or duplicity. COVID-19, while it affects things and people in a manner we might consider evil if done intentionally by a conscious being, is in its nature not a moral thing, good nor evil. Only our response can be moral or immoral. To just give over to it through ignorance or through panic seems unacceptable. That would be surrendering to what Kearney places as the, quote, negative horror of the real. A surrender he characterizes as that of to a psychological death drive, merging the concept of Kantian diabolical evil with what Freud identified within human beings as thanatos. Not the Marvel ultravillain, but a so-called death drive. But yeah, same thing. Paranoia is animated by this drive which, hold on, I just have a scrap of paper here where I wrote, drive is the Freudian term for the Hegelian infinite play of the idea with itself. I have no idea what that means. I just have it here and it's marked as important. I don't even know if that's mine or a quote. However, we can see an infinite replaying of the idea, of the apprehension of this unlimitable other as the kind of paranoid obsession that many of us have at one time or another experienced as paralyzing, or as something that actually causes us to skip confronting the real thing terrifying us and focus on issues beside the point. A perfectly understandable denial is flight reflex. One of the more practically useful observations in Zizek's pandemic is that the panic buying of toilet paper, non-perishables, and hand sanitizers a year ago made a satire of the real problem, the pandemic, by making the situation about something essentially trivial and that, as we all know well now, is not really the problem, or was ever even a problem at all. There was never a shortage of toilet paper, The warehouses just couldn't move them to stores fast enough when suddenly the demand for available units on the shelf multiplied exponentially. And besides, COVID isn't dysentery. Our actual consumption of toilet paper, I am sure, has not appreciably been changed by this experience. Unless we hit a fourth wave and the next thing to explode on TikTok and Instagram is paper mache. In Kearney's book, he discusses the introduction to an exhibition at De Cordova in 2001. The exhibition was titled Terrors and Wonders, Monsters in Contemporary Art. Using this as a backdrop, he then goes on to discuss, among other representations, the argument that presents the archetype of the alien invader as one who is constantly presented to us in popular, folk, and political cultures as a species that acts as a hybrid of within and without. Psychologically, I think that COVID-19 is in harmony with this alien archetype, and that the monstrousness of the pandemic exists within the milieu of our response to it, as well as the social order that it has tested and so far has in some ways found wanting, like our overstressed healthcare and social services, the high wire of our economics, and insistence on big or mass business as almost a repetition of the too big to fail fiasco of 2008's economic crisis, and the confused way our lockdowns have mandated who gets to be an essential business and have customers funneled through their doors, but the way that they have determined what is essential, who is essential. Of course, in other ways, we've been found worthy in the face of this trial. Our ability to adapt, to find new ways of fulfilling our needs and coping with our existence, our will to sustain human connection, confronting ourselves after losing so many former sources of distraction or affirmation, so many crutches when the distractions wore thin in lockdown. During the pandemic, the monster rears up still, not as the senseless, mindless, viral thing, but in the sense of the repressed other, the paranoia obsessing over continuing our way of life from the before times. Like I said, our monster in the modern style is not a metaphor. It is the thing itself, or rather I should say it is our experience itself. Either that or the suddenly radically suspect character of other humans as an experience. We are defining the pandemic not through things that represent it, not even through our habits or new routines, but by the feeling of it, the strangeness itself that suffuses our hours. Like the thing, it is not revealed at the end as a secret government weapon or a mystic conspiracy or a legitimate alien invasion. The pandemic is simply contact with the material mechanics of life on Earth at a point of confluence where all the tensions of our modern world meet, and the contradictions inherent cause the whole global civilization-wide megastructure to short out. The thing, the novel coronavirus, both are just self-replicating life cycles, not villains, that hijack our likeness and our habits like a costume, stowing away inside our habitus. The cloak of socially ingrained and practiced knowledge, habits, dispositions, and appearances through which we perceive and interact socially, personally. According to sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, something we acquire through mimesis, or imitation of others in the social structure we are integrating with. It is not the virus cells, but the habitus that the sublime monster is embodied within, that evokes our equivocal response of anxiety and attraction, that makes us amalgams of imitations indistinguishable from our imitators. We are confronted by the question, what makes us more than self-replicating lifestyles? The appearance of a monster, or when something appears as a monster, reveals. The Latin root of monster, monstrare, is to demonstrate. To reference Kearney again, nothing less than our craving to put a face on a phobia. Be that phobia Red Scare, fascism, poor hygiene, social currency, economic insecurity. And in doing so, quote, reveal the undecidable character of many of our neat divisions and borders. This is how some of the aspects of the order of society may still exist as recognizable forms, but no longer have the former recognized meaning. Conceptually, there is the already problematic idea of the correlation between working hard and earning power, ideas about social services and state handouts, about money, None of these have functioned quite the same way in the shared symbolic structure over the past year as they may have appeared to previously, when they allowed us to triangulate our own identity and others, in part by our relationship to these ideas within that structure. The result is ambiguity. The practical nature of nurturing our most important relationships and even our basic social signifiers has become, over the past year, similarly indefinite. Something so basic no longer reassures us it is okay to come closer, and instead a respectful distance is now meant to signal even the care of love and intimacy. Abandonment is protection, and a lifestyle of economic impotence was for a few months there seen as taking active precautionary measurements. The kind of online presence I've talked about being chastised for as antisocial behavior not all that long ago became good social coping skills, at least until we all burnt the fuck out in front of our webcams. For most of us, our direct knowledge of the pandemic has come through the indirect, detached media, social and traditional, informing without touching our real lives. Our sharing in the danger would, for many, be vicarious and diversionary only if it were not for the legitimate reach of the paranoia created by the unknown element, introduced by its ability to transgress all known boundaries with sublime ambivalence. This paranoia and how it is acted out by individuals and governing bodies as a paradoxical blend of conviction and uncertainty is then the source of actual immediate threat. Meanwhile, everything becomes animated by the totalitarian aesthetic mode of existence we looked at before in the isolation section. Acceptance, the final stage of loss and grieving, is not about giving over to the demands of a hypothetical thanatos and being unbothered by any of this. It is about recognizing the presence of permeability and permutation, change and exchange, and that this condition has no explicit evil intention to appear, invade, and destroy us, but is already a part of existence. It just is. It doesn't care about us. We care about us, and so we care about it. And that is enough. It's worth it to McCready and the research team to remain themselves human, for the rest of the world to remain human, even if it means to do so at the cost of their means of survival. Mortal doom is for them a far better fate than inhuman damnation. The thing, a virus, cannot be evil, but our response to it can be good. In opposition to the formless, we can impose our own and act as restorers of order if we are prepared and capable of recognizing that form in ourselves and reclaiming what parts of it we have foisted upon the other, and which parts only exist in the substance of our relationship to what is other, others known and others uncertain. But the caveat to this is not to treat our particular internally congruent forms as ultimate, or else we are no different than the thing. In fact, I would argue the consequences would make us morally worse. Snitch lines and panopticon-style self-surveillance refracting responsibility for collective hardships onto rule breakers, like this was a game of Among Us, while governments continue to dither through their internally inconsistent pandemic measures behind a smokescreen of mutual suspicion, or ignoring inconvenient realities and denying your potential role in contributing to or mitigating human death and suffering because our best knowledge at the time conflicts with your opinion and makes your feelings uncomfortable and maybe a little tenuous. I would posit that neither of these are acceptable or adequate responses to the pandemic, being extremes of two examples of thinking, two spheres of paranoia. But what gives them their moral capacity is that they are choices we have to make for ourselves, one way or another. Acceptance means recognizing loss, but also what cannot be lost, and what can still be preserved or even gained through the experience of that loss, if we are willing to confront it and work through it. The paranoia that ripped apart the research team throughout the thing, that maybe even prevented them from a better, less costly outcome, is the far more dangerous monster than the thing itself. It is the true other, because it not only can lead to the destruction of our lives, but it turns these lives into something unreal, monstrous, something we reject and deny. And in that constant denial of affirmation, because everything is suspect aside from suspicion itself, is the paranoia. Not the distancing and the isolation, not the economic freeze. It's not even the virus itself that in most cases infects and potentially ruins everything that was us or our lives in a fundamentally important way. There is no acceptance with paranoia, and until we dispel paranoia, we lose everything. Most dangerously, we lose our critical faculties to their paranoid homunculi imposters and can't know the difference. It wasn't until the end of the thing that they stopped worrying about suspecting each other long enough to realize who was actually a threat and what had to be done. And by that time, the only option was to literally burn it all down. We have the opportunity to accept what is not lost, what important parts of living and of our values are actually not existentially endangered by the pandemic, by our experience of it, by our reactions to it. By now, we should be able to make out the difference between lives worth living and the specific ways of living them that can be suspended or modified. The thing at its cellular nature, every cell and individual organism, coronavirus, these are mindless preconscious life forms, scarcely even animals. Even the most horrific beast only becomes a monster through our fear of it, and monsters, not being real, only become dangerous, only have power to act through our fear of one another, through our fear of the real, a fear brought about by insufficiently critical or poorly ordered mistrust. Listening to radio interviews on the CBC, I've heard a few exhausted doctors and nurses take a breath and then say they actually aren't afraid of contracting the Rona. This is not a universal opinion. Some healthcare workers have been petrified of being infected and spreading that to their families, and more recently scandalized at not being prioritized for vaccination. But it's a common enough refrain for me to mention. The healthcare providers I'm talking about are, of course, concerned. They say, I'm very concerned about bringing home the virus on me, to my family. But on the other hand, I'm not too worried about it. For these individuals, their active engagement mediates the atmosphere of fear and paranoia, filtering down to practical, reasonable caution. A nurse or doctor is far more likely to be exposed to the virus than most of us, so why do some of us have this resilience to the paranoia? It's not the burnout, it's not bravery, it's not arrogance. They're not rendered helpless by the unknown. They have no need and no time, frankly, for the ineffective symbolizations or conspiracy theories or perservations and hand-wringing. For them, the pandemic is quite tangible and there is a clear course of action. And while this is anything but business as usual for their job description, their job has always been to provide care through the practice of Western medicine, and this means that, unlike most of us, the meaningful structure of their world order is not similarly affected, at least not within the workspace. For them, the coronavirus is not a weird denizen of the real, it's tangible reality. It is almost routine in a certain way. It still functions within the established symbols and codes and orders of the medical world. They find themselves in a mad routine, but nonetheless, they don't wonder if they've been in contact with it. They know they have, and they know they've taken the best possible precaution against it. The nature of the monstrous chimerical fear we confront, experience, or refuse is not unique to the pandemic. The mistrust and confusion and fear when what we perceive to be fundamental boundaries break down and overlap is the same paranoia that gives rise to xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, racism, sexism. Zizek writes in his book about the ways the virus has enhanced existing narratives of mistrust, paranoia, and bigotry, as well as the recent ideological stress on the concept of clear borders and quarantining threats to quasi-biological national identities. But uncertainty doesn't have to be threatening, though it's okay if it is. Uncomfortable as it may be, the cause of the deepest-seated paranoia of the pandemic isn't caused by simply the fear of catching ill, isn't the fear of being manipulated and controlled by the state. It isn't even about mortal fear. It isn't about the questions we ask or fail to ask. The holistic experience of the pandemic questions us. While in these varying states of lockdown, we have been made, as individuals and as a culture, to redefine what it means to be an individual in a society, unless we wish to remain in a state of denial, a state of fear, and a state of loss. It's a shock to find we cannot take the society of our peers for granted any longer. Not only that, but we find ourselves thrown into the suspicious void of paranoia, suspended there until we individually learn to recalibrate our being in the world and are reciprocally accepted by others who have learned to do the same. And to do so will require a flexibility and an openness to the unwanted lesson that boundaries and order are not fixed, that the illusion the status quo upholds is simply that, an illusion of a status quo, that all things are permeable, and that the face of everything you care about is contingent, and if you're unable to keep up with its shifting appearance, you may mistake the very thing you're trying to protect and sacrifice it, all the while clinging to a disease-ridden imposter. The last thing I want to say is that I don't think this paranoia is the exclusive property of those for whom the pressure of the pandemic itself leads them to the point of extreme anxiety. In fact, I would stake the claim that the ones most threatened, most stricken, most shaken to their core by the kind of paranoia, isolation, and sublime terror that I've tried to analyze in this series are not those who some might identify as overreacting, but are more likely the ones arguably underreacting, or who refute and refuse some of the major premises of the immediate scientific consensus for a narrative constructed by alternative sources, of whatever kind you like. And this despite all the problems of those mainstream sources, all the primary disseminators of the information available to us. Their technologies of knowledge and communication, their ramifications. Now, I really don't want to make this a 2-hour installment, and I'm running out of time to do that. I think it's been more than long enough, and frankly, there's more in life to think about than the pandemic, so I'm not able to go through it all here. But I think where I haven't been explicit, I've left enough suggestion throughout this series for you to make the connections for yourself. And if you're interested, I'd like you to think about the things I've said, about the disruptive effects of the pandemic as a whole that I've tried to talk about, and think what kinds of systems, political positions, ideologies, and external personal identifications the analysis in these videos has identified as threatened or put into question by the phenomenological experience of the pandemic. Which ones might have an interest in resisting the scientific consensus and forming the form of responses to the pandemic taken, or the risks that, if not them, then others might face. What or who might resist or feel a real emotional need to deny the validity of the reflection the pandemic mirror holds up to pre-pandemic society, and by extension themselves within it, in the name of self-interest, propagation, perpetuation. Take those beliefs, those points of view, and take a look at what the overlap is or isn't between them and those whose fear is of the word or of the body. Is there a strong correlation between groups or individuals holding certain ideas and the ones whose sense of security or identity would be threatened if everything I've said about the pandemic is true? Consider the harm of living paralyzed in fear of the virus, of picking one of dozens of single, small, statistical possibilities of risk to run and ruin your life. But consider also, are the ones who accuse anyone who wears a mask and self-isolates of being a part of a lumpen sheep herd, ruminating in ignorance the fear spread by their conspiracy of overlords, are they the ones more afraid, more threatened of losing their identity when confronted with change? Are the ones who claim the vaccine isn't even a vaccine doing so because their peace of mind can't afford the science to be true? And remember that anyone who has to tell you they are a critical thinker probably isn't, or else it would be self-evident. The most violent response is always the response born of fear, but the greatest show of violence isn't the greatest exhibition of strength. So are we stronger than our fear? And what will it take to find out? So that's it. Those are my thoughts on the thing and the coronavirus pandemic. I want to sincerely thank you for giving me your time and valuable attention. I hope this has all been accessible and, if not easy, that you may have found it helpful, or even if you disagree with what I've said, you at least found it interesting. Hopefully you've even been entertained from time to time. Feel absolutely welcome to share and discuss whatever you like in the comments. Try to keep it civil. I tried to be as comprehensive and open as possible in presenting you with my interpretations, and I hope that that attempt to capture as many angles as possible didn't get too tangled up. I know I didn't really stake out a firm position to argue from, and instead this was really trying to be more of a broader observation, a thematic analysis. So I hope that there was enough of a through line with the themes that it was easy enough to follow without a polemical thesis to argue. There's honestly a few things I still wanted to add in here, and there are some issues I missed entirely. I actually wrote another 40 pages as a wide-ranging roundup of everything on my mind outside the 3 themes of this series, but you know what? I think this is enough. I think this is what John Carpenter's The Thing can teach us about our pandemic, about the struggle to remain human, and for that to mean something.